Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Mouthy Money podcast. We're looking at something a bit different than usual today, because I think typically we cover sort of, very mainstream personal finance topics and big economic issues, and sometimes even a little bit of politics and that kind of thing. Today, we're looking at something I would probably describe as being quite a sensitive subject, and that is the topic of vulnerability and how vulnerability kind of matters in the setting of kind of financial services. So I'm joined by a really interesting guest today called Helen Lord. Helen, welcome.
Hello.
Helen, just tell us a little bit about yourself and the organisation that you come from, and then we'll talk a little bit about what we're gonna discuss today.
Okay, so my background is pretty much solidly in financial services. I spent 20 odd years working for a credit reference agency. Since then, I've done quite a bit around data protection, particularly when GDPR came in. But I think fundamentally, I've always been involved in some kind of customer service, typically people who are struggling with financial difficulty, with a regulatory backdrop to that. The vulnerability registration service kicked off really in 2016, and I am the CEO. We're a small organisation. We set up really recognising that organisations, particularly in financial services, were struggling to manage and deal with their customers who are in vulnerable circumstances, and there was increasing regulatory pressure, which is still continuing and gaining more and more momentum, to put an onus on those organisations to support vulnerable individuals in the right way. So we wanted to create a way of individuals, whether they were financially vulnerable or otherwise, being able to have a voice to express their circumstances to organisations, and to encourage those organisations to treat them appropriately in the right way and give them a level of support.
So the vulnerability registration service, like you say, it's fairly new. If it launched in 2016, what kind of motivated you to get involved in it? And obviously now as the chief executive, what kind of, what is your motivation behind it? Obviously vulnerability is such an important issue, but kind of want to understand a bit better from your perspective.
Yeah, when I say we look at vulnerability not just from a financial perspective, I think what's important about what we do is we're looking at the context around that financial difficulty, plus financial difficulty in sorry, cause and effect, really. So if somebody is rendered financially in difficult circumstances, it may be created by life events, it may be created by health. Equally, those financial difficulties may lead to other things, and it can impact on things like mental health. So that's the context around it. I think from my point of view, and some of these may be being applied in hindsight, having gone through the process over a number of years of doing this, but my professional background is very much dealing and helping people who are struggling with debt. But I think historically, while we've always had a handle on people who are struggling to pay their bills, we never really considered why that might be, or what that was causing, or how we could help those people. So as a credit reference agency, it was, hello, Mr. Consumer, you are in debt. How are you going to pay your bills? Not what can be done to support and what can be done to help. I also saw a lot of vulnerable people falling victim to scams, to fraud, with really no defence against that. So there's that side of it, and I suppose I suffer the same frustrations that we all suffer when we're dealing with organisations and we're trying to express ourselves and get things done and get support. And I think people who are really struggling and are overwhelmed by their circumstances have a much harder path to follow, navigating call centres, navigating internet sites, and trying to find the support that's available to them. And then I suppose that the really personal side of it, from my side of things, that my father suffered from Alzheimer's. I saw somebody who was very competent, able to deal with his financial affairs, able to deal with anything, rendered unable to deal with any of that, becoming, totally vulnerable, ending up in a care home, and also saw my mother struggling to care for that person. And we've done a lot of work recently around carers, because we believe that carers are rendered vulnerable by default, and that's a really important aspect of what we do as well. Those people who are trying to act on somebody else's behalf, and the struggles that are involved in that. So those are my drivers, and my colleagues would cite different things, but I don't think we can be very sensitive about the word vulnerable, and people are, but in reality, we can be all sort of riding the crest of a wave, and everything's going great, and we don't know what's going to come and hit us in the face, and what's going to put us in difficult circumstances, and take us off our stride. So the reality is, vulnerability can apply to any of us at any given time.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point, and obviously, that personal story there. I think that's it adds an important context, doesn't it? I mean, I was a full-time carer for my mum when she was sick many years ago now, so I kind of have been there in that experience as well, and being able to kind of have that pressure taken off you when you're having to work around financial firms, or basically any kind of firm really, who you want to just give you a little bit more, it's not about preferential treatment, is it? It's about just a little bit of a more understanding that this person might be in a little bit more difficult circumstance than your average customer.
I think the reality of being a carer, and I am a carer for my mother, who's 92. I mean, you are impacted in terms of having very limited time, because you are looking after somebody else, and you're looking after their finances and everything that goes with that as well. And it probably takes you twice as long to justify yourself. And your own health and mental well-being is hugely impacted, and your own finances are impacted. I mean, the reality is that, carers get carers allowance, and it's £81 something a week. Well, who can realistically live on that? And I think if we put the whole vulnerability story into perspective, you start to look at the sort of the whole impact upon the UK. We're talking caring alone, we're talking nearly 6 million people. We're talking people who are financially impacted. And I guess just to go a little bit political, I guess we didn't focus very strongly in manifestos around things like social care, but we know that carers alone are saving the UK economy about £162 billion, and yet we're talking about unemployment rates and mental health rates. Well, maybe we should pull back a little bit and look at the cause rather than the symptoms sometimes.
I think that is a really, really interesting point. One of the political parties did try and talk about it, and
Yeah,
that was Ed Davey, the Liberal Democrats, didn't he? Because he's
yeah,
a carer for his son, I believe, if I'm not
yes,
wrong. So that it is positive to see signs that there are, is a discussion happening there at a kind of political
it is.
level. And I think that point about kind of how much money that carers save the economy by doing that that effectively unpaid work is really, really interesting. A rabbit hole perhaps that we shall avoid today. Um, I mean, vulnerability is such a difficult. It's a difficult thing to put in a box, isn't it? Because it happens in so many different ways to so many different people. Let's
Yeah.
bring it back to, in practical terms, what the VRS does, and kind of how that helps people who are in vulnerable situations, potentially have relatives in vulnerable situations. How does it work in practice?
And I think you're absolutely right, and that is the problem, is being able to really get a handle on who is actually vulnerable, and that's why organisations from all sectors really struggle with it massively. It's it's a huge massive subject. So what we have to try and do is almost compartmentalize it and put it into brackets. So you have your financially vulnerable individuals, but equally you have people that are struggling with health, and that might be physical health, it might be mental health. We also have people that have life events. So if somebody is going through perhaps a difficult relationship breakdown, if they are suffering from bereavement, if they're having a baby, it may impact their financial affairs. And that's the reality. It's usually financial affairs that mean that an organisation is interacting with you. And it's trying to really get a grasp of what's relevant to that organisation and how that organisation can help you. So if it's a life event, if you are in debt, for example, then if that company knows that perhaps you are going through a difficult relationship breakdown, what are the timescales potentially involved in that? Do you need to be given some breathing space? Can I talk to you? Can I engage with you? And engagement is really the key, and it's very difficult to do because our natural reaction as human beings is, if you're in debt, is almost to bury your head in the sand, hide away, and not answer all those texts and telephone calls and emails that are coming in and harassing you. So there are things that you can do in that respect. Then there's the communication accessibility side of things. And that is, we just need a big dose of common sense, really. If somebody is telling you that English isn't their first language, or that they are struggling with technology, or they're visually or hearing impaired, or they have dyslexia, then if you know that up front, you can change the way you communicate with them. And that is very simple. It's changing your processes and procedures to adapt to that. And once you know, the path is a lot smoother right from the outset, rather than somebody having to repeat their circumstances again and again and again. So you've got that aspect of it. And I think with things like mental health, I mean, how can you sort of define mental health? It affects us all in different ways, and that is why large organizations are thinking, okay, what do I do? What do I tell my 100, 200, 1,000 customer service staff to do if somebody's telling me that they are suffering with their mental health? Well, sometimes I think that's when you have to filter out those individuals in circumstances, and you have to case manage sometimes. But a lot of vulnerability, just as I say, needs a big dose of common sense, and it needs us to sit back and think, well, what do we do if this person is telling us X, Y, Z, and how would they want to be treated? We're talking human beings here, and I think it's very tempting for us to want to put, react to vulnerability with a big sort of corporate tick boxing exercise. And unfortunately, it doesn't work like that. The reality is we've got to grow up and accept the fact that, this is human nature that we're dealing with, and we need to create ways of managing those circumstances that people are in.
So when it comes to who using your service,
Yeah.
who is the burden on here? Is it for people who might think that they're in vulnerable circumstances to register with you, or do you have businesses that encourage people to go on to the register? How does that work in practice?
So it works in both ways. People can register with us online. So we take the minimal amount of personal detail that we can to do the job. So name, address, date of birth, and then we give people the option of highlighting the type of vulnerability that they are finding themselves in. So, as I said, I've given you some of the categories, but it can range from at risk of coercion to being a carer, to struggling with technology, to struggling with mental health, physical health, just being struggling with their financial capability. I think we've got about 30 odd different flags. So people can highlight those, and often it's more than one. We know the synergies between mental health and financial health. Some people tick many of those boxes. But those flags then allow organisations to get that heads up, if you like, that their customer is in that situation, and adapt their behaviour, their support to that individual throughout a customer journey. And I would say sometimes it's not relevant. Just because somebody's citing vulnerability, it doesn't mean it necessarily changes the treatment path, the relationship, the customer journey with that person. It certainly doesn't mean that if somebody's vulnerable, that they don't have to pay their debts anymore. That's not what we're about, but it means that they can get help. So in answer to your question, individuals can register themselves. People who hold a legal authority to register somebody. So if there's a power of attorney, we will validate that. If there's a court of protection, we work with a lot of councils, legal firms, money management companies where there's a court order in place and they are managing an individual's finances on their behalf. They can share data with us. We work with some domestic abuse charities. We work with people like the illegal money lending team who deal with victims of loan sharks. So those organisations can share data with us if they have the consent of the individual, or they can signpost people to us, which happens a lot, so like the Alzheimer's Society or Carers UK or whoever it may be. I mean, there's a lot of charities in the UK and there's still a lot of awareness we've got to do, but any organisation trying to give individual support can signpost to us. And then I guess the final way is if we are working, say, with a bank, with a gaming company, with a council, with a water company, whoever it may be, they can work with us and share data back into us on their customers' behalf. So if they're having a conversation with a vulnerable customer, and they gauge that vulnerability, they can work with us, gain the consent directly from the customer and make it as simple as possible. So there's lots of routes into sharing data. I mean, this is like a real sort of snowball effect. It gains momentum, and what we do becomes more effective the more people engage with it.
Yeah, I think it's really, I mean, from my experience, recent experience, actually, it is for me encouraging to see that more companies do seem to engage with and have be mindful of the issue. I mean, my it's not not vulnerability per se, but I had an interaction with my energy provider recently just about some billing stuff, and they asked at the end of the call, just before you go, we wanted to check, is there anybody in your household who you think qualifies you for being on priority services register? And I was like, well, I don't know. I mean, we've got a 9-month-old baby. And they're like, oh yeah, okay, all right. And a few days later, we got a whole load of information, and we're now on a priority. So if there's a power outage and that kind of thing, and I think even the water company then did it as well, where they'll kind of they'll prioritize the customers who are in the most kind of need. And I mean, look, my wife and I are in perfectly good health and would sort our baby out no matter what happened. But it's interesting to know that those things are now there for people. This kind of
Yeah.
brings on to my next question, which was, in financial services specifically, we've had a kind of a big piece of legislation, a big piece of new regulation come through, Consumer Duty. Has that changed how financial services firms are now having to approach the issue of something like vulnerability? And is there work to be done to improve those outcomes still for customers of financial companies?
Yeah, and I think Consumer Duty is brilliant in terms of financial services. There is definitely momentum in terms of managing vulnerability in customers, and you've used the example of energy and water companies. I think the reality is it's much bigger than one sector. If you are vulnerable, then it's applicable to your council, to government, it's applicable to energy, water, it's applicable to your mobile phone provider, your bank, everybody. So how many times should you actually have to voice the fact that you're in those vulnerable circumstances when you're overwhelmed and you are struggling? And I guess that's what we're all about, is trying to give a one-stop shop, a one route into people expressing that. So yes, I think Consumer Duty is brilliant. I think it has really put vulnerability high on the agenda in terms of financial services. I think what you just said about the priority service register is reflective of what's slowly happening in the water and energy world. But there is still a huge amount to do in terms of data sharing. There is a fear in terms of data protection and getting it wrong, and I would dearly love for there to be some real definitive advice about what can and can't be done in terms of data sharing around vulnerability, because organisations are scared. And I think there is also a little bit of a danger of having a piece of regulation and sort of going through the motions and doing the bare minimum. As I say, vulnerability doesn't lend itself to corporate procedures and corporate tick boxes. It needs to be applied, and it needs that big sort of piece of common sense applied to it. So the appetite is undeniably there. The regulators are definitely acting. but it's slow, and I think more needs to be done, and I think more needs to be done collectively. There is no point doing it organisation by organisation or sector by sector. It needs to be really pulled together, I believe.
Yeah, it's really, and I think really interesting. The other thing as well is these companies from almost purely cynical point of view. It's kind of like we no longer exist in a world where being caught doing things to customers that doesn't look good is going to do you any good at this point. And we're in a kind of very online world where bad stories spread quickly, and bad customer service. The old thing about people never talk about when they have a kind of a good experience, but people will tell 10 people when they have a bad experience, kind of thing. So there's kind of it makes business sense for these companies to be treating people as properly as possible.
It makes absolute business sense, and if we look at it in a sort of hard-nosed business way, it's not just the reputational impact, it's not just the fact that you may fall foul of the regulators. It's the fact that you might be having one conversation with a customer instead of 10 conversations with a customer. You may improve engagement by understanding their circumstances. So going back to that debt scenario where somebody is hiding away and doesn't want to speak to you, if you are dealing with them and helping them and giving them light at the end of the tunnel, they are going to engage with you. So unfortunately, there's only really anecdotal evidence at the moment in terms of cost saving and time saving, but it's a real thing. And you don't have to think very hard to think how many times you've had to phone your bank or your mobile phone company or sat on the line explaining your circumstances to know that it's not just absolutely irritating from your own perspective, it is costing them money at the same time.
That is a really interesting point, especially because there's a lot of conversation at the moment, particularly with things like AI and stuff like that, which is obviously a big, very buzzwordy thing, but where big, banks and other large businesses are almost rolling back some of their customer service touch points, right? Where you can just find a number on a website and call up. And I have that frustration all the time,
Yeah.
tracking down a phone number to just speak to somebody when you've got an issue and you're kind of faced with a chatbot who you have to get past first. And these are just mind-bending hurdles for somebody who's got no kind of other issues. When somebody's in a vulnerable position, it make it feel 100 times worse.
And it's getting that balance, and you're never going to get that balance perfectly correctly. I mean, very often, you might easily deal with your issue very quickly through a chat room or whatever, but perhaps don't sort of send a sort of 90-year-old chap down that route, because he might be very technically capable, but the chances are he's perhaps going to struggle a little bit. So it's really using that common sense and trying to come as much together with common sense guidelines as much as possible. We're not going to get it right every single time, but there's a lot more we can do that we don't do at the moment.
Brilliant. Helen, just before we finish off, where can people, if people want to find out more information about the VRS, where's the best place to go as a starting point?
It is our website, the Vulnerability Registration Service.co.uk. You can register through that. We've also got a Facebook site, and I think the other thing that's worth adding to that is that we are increasingly, and it is work in progress, but we are increasingly using what we do to help people find the support that's available to them. And that might be things like broadband discounts, it might be water discounts, it may be pointing people to the Alzheimer's Society or avoiding scams. There's a whole range of things, helping people identify debt advice, trying to passport people to the support that's available to them. So it's worth looking on there. And I mean, the world's the limit. The sky's the limit on this. Hopefully, this all gains momentum, and more support will be found in one place. And we do collaborate as much as possible with other organisations that are doing similar things. So it's not just alerting organisations to the fact that somebody's vulnerable. We're also trying to help those individuals find the support that's available to them at the same time.
No, I will say, I mean, I think what you're doing is really valuable work. And I mean, kind of more than happy to have you come and tell us about it so we can help try and even
Thank
our
you.
own little way spread the word. I think it's so important. So thank you, Helen. I really appreciate just learning a bit more about it. And hopefully we can, improve the situation as much as possible for the people who need it. Thank you, everybody, for listening to another episode of the podcast. You can obviously catch us on Apple, Spotify. We're now on YouTube as well, and TikTok, because we're cool that way. Plus everything else you need to know on the website and obviously the newsletter. Helen, thank you again.
No, thank you for having me.
And thank you, everybody, for listening. I hope to speak to you all again soon, and goodbye.